Today, I'm going to attempt to connect the basic genealogies of the gods from all of the world's major pantheons, showing how they all connect and how certain well-known characters may have hidden stories in other world mythologies. To do this, we won't be starting with the beginnings of mythology in Egypt or Babylon, but rather, I think it's smart to start with the most recognizable religious and mythological figures, particularly that of the Greek tradition. Christianity is, of course, one of the largest religions in the world today, and perhaps the most well-known, but due to its monotheistic interpretation of world mythologies, the Greek becomes the most recognized mythology in the West to actually trace the lineage of the gods. The Greek gods have very elaborate genealogies that we will be diving into today, but the key characters we will be exploring across all of the world mythologies are that of Zeus and his two brothers. While Greek mythology can vary on details from one tradition to the next, it's very well understood by people around the world thanks to our pop culture that Zeus is the king of the Olympian gods and splits the world into three domains for himself and his two brothers. Zeus himself is known as a god of thunder, using thunderbolts or lightning bolts as his primary weapon. Zeus has one brother known as Poseidon, whose domain is the sea, and another brother named Hades, who is said to rule the underworld. These are three very peculiar themes for what we think of as the chief gods in a pantheon, with Poseidon worship in Greece even predating the worship of Zeus, and yet these three themes appear to be found in the genealogies of the gods all over the world. When it comes to the Romans, it is well understood that their pantheon is practically the same as the Greek, but with different names. There, Zeus is known as Jupiter, Poseidon as Neptune, and Hades as Pluto. Interestingly, the Romans didn't just adopt the Greek religion over their own, but rather they recognized that their religions had similar roots and used the Greek mythology to fill in the gaps of their own, which still had differences in story rooted in their own historical perspective. This is because these gods are not representations of true divine spirits, but rather they are the historical metaphors of the people who thought them up. This trend started largely as ancestor worship deep in humanity's past, where the stories of our ancestors would be elevated and glorified to a state of godhood as more and more generations have their own stories and struggles added to that of their divine patriarchs. This is why every family was said to have its own patron deity in many cultures. This is evident in the Greek mythology itself, where Zeus is the father of the majority of deities revered in each of the Greek city-states. In Athens, they worshipped Athena, a goddess known for her great intellect. Athens saw themselves as the intellectual heart of Greece, and as such, her metaphorical story is that she was born not between Zeus and some goddess the way the other gods were, but rather she was born directly out of the head of Zeus with no mother at all. The people of Sparta, on the other hand, worshipped Ares, the god of war, because their civilization was based largely around its military. Ares, of course, also being a son of Zeus. This tradition wasn't just found in Greece, but all over the ancient world, with the larger chief deities like Zeus being the father that ruled over all of these smaller gods who represented these smaller cities and tribes. Zeus then could be said to represent the Greek people as a whole, and that is very true, but Zeus as the chief god can also represent a history that extends further back than the independence of the Greek people, to a time described in Greek mythology as the Great Titan War. Most of what we know about early Greek mythology comes from Hesiod's Theogony from the 8th century before Christ. Theos meaning God and geni meaning generations, Theogony is an attempt to create a genealogy of the gods. At this point, much of Greek mythology was local, as Greece wasn't known as one united peoples. They had a shared language and mythology and thus a shared culture, but were often competing or even at war with each other. This meant that different traditions would arise, leading to each city-state worshipping its own local god, while still sharing the chief god of Zeus. Hesiod's work was one that attempted to tie all of these different myths together, many of which were already starting to be connected through genealogical-type poems before Hesiod's time. Hesiod's Theogony is essentially a final outcome of him trying to piece together everyone's different histories, perhaps even changing many details that weren't necessarily there in order to show how these people really do connect. It was a study of all of the myths of his time, with many of them not even being written down or just recently being put to paper. Because of that, theogony becomes a timeline of our existence based on what could be inferred from the Greek myths at the time, a succession of gods from the beginning of creation down to Zeus and his own children who ruled in that then modern age. This means that Zeus himself only reflects the Greek people up to a certain extent, with some of his history being more so about the greater tribe that the Greeks once came from. This tribe is what we refer to today as the Proto-Indo-Europeans, the early group that, as the name suggests, would go on to populate Europe. The traces of this mythology can be found all over the world, with Zeus and Jupiter as well as other thunder gods, hailing back to the chief god of the Proto-Indo-European pantheon, the Sky Father. This Sky Father was referred to as Deus Pater, from which we are believed to get the names for Zeus or Zeus and Jupiter or Deus Pater. The Sky Father was an early reference to the sun, which was often the central object of worship by ancient peoples. Being the father of all in the sky, the sun itself would be blamed for thunderstorms, hence why he would adopt the power of thunderbolts in various world cultures. While this pantheon did include a god of the sea and a god of the underworld, there is no connection between these three deities such as found in the Greek, Roman, and other later mythologies where they are brothers. And instead, the division of the chief god into this new generation of three entities seems to be rooted in the dispersal of the Proto-Indo-Europeans into different geographical regions, as can be proved through the Greek mythology and those that surrounded them. Perhaps the most interesting with its genealogical similarities to the Greek pantheon is that of the Canaanites, about 1,000 miles across the Mediterranean Sea from the Greeks, with quite a few other civilizations along the way of the coast between them. While Hesiod's theogony only dates back to the 8th century before Christ, the Ugarites of the area had their own mythology written down, traced to as far back as the 12th century before Christ. The story, important to the Ugarites and the Canaanites as a whole, was called the Baal cycle, and depicted a battle between their chief god Baal and his brothers Yam and Mot. Baal, like Zeus, is a god of thunder and storms, with his brother Yam being the god of the ocean, just like Poseidon, and his brother Mot being the god of the underworld, just like his brother Hades. Now, in the Baal cycle, Baal, or Zeus, doesn't have a good relationship with his brothers the way he does in the Greek mythology, where they team up to fight against the Titans. The Baal cycle itself is about how Baal, or who we think of as Zeus, has to choose to rise to power to tame the other two gods. This begins with Baal or Zeus first going to battle against Yam or Poseidon before emerging victorious. Following this, Baal or Zeus descends into the underworld, where he dies and then is resurrected in his battle against Mot, who we would think of as Hades. Baal is resurrected by his sister Anat, and then he goes on to defeat Mot before returning to his place of power on the throne. This story comes from a time centuries before the Greek mythology would be formalized by Hesiod, but there are elements of it within Greek mythology. Before the Olympians, in Greek mythology, there were those Titans, the most important of these being Cronus, Iapetus, and Oceanus. The Titans were 12 in number, representing the tribes of men who ruled the world before the era that would be defined by the worship of Zeus. Zeus and his brothers are able to overthrow the Titans, however, it wasn't without the help of Prometheus, who like Zeus was the son of a Titan, this one named Iapetus. Prometheus, interestingly, was not a god worshipped the way that Zeus was as the chief god of Greece, nor was he worshipped the way Athena or Ares were as more local gods to their city-states, or even the way Poseidon was as the chief god of the area before the Proto-Indo-Europeans would bring in their worship of Zeus. Prometheus is essentially the main character of Hesiod's theogony, with the stories of this and his other narrative, Works and Days, being about the consequences of Prometheus's actions. Despite his prominence in Hesiod's works, there is no mention of Prometheus in the hymns or prayers of Homer, which includes prayers dedicated to over 20 gods and goddesses from the same century. Because theogony was a complex work meant to fill in the gaps of history using mythological figures, Prometheus seems to have developed as a tradition that helped to further emphasize the separate role of the Greeks from what we would think of as the father tribe that they hailed from in the Proto-Indo-Europeans. While the majority of city-states in Greece worshipped gods who were descended from Zeus as discussed earlier, the Greek people themselves were said to descend from none other than Prometheus. Interestingly, humans are described as facing a few different destructions in Hesiod's works, with a great flood leading to humans needing to be repopulated by the descendants of Prometheus himself. With gods in mythology representing tribes of people who have risen to power, the creation of humans was less about the creation of actual humanity and more about the creation of the local peoples. In the case of Hesiod's theogony, the creation of humans represents the creation of a new colony whose work was largely that of farming, an outpost to an earlier, more established tribe, such as we might say the Titans and the later Olympians represented. Prometheus then, creating the humans in the more primeval mythology of the Greeks, represents how Hesiod specifically saw Prometheus as the ancestor of the Greek peoples, which is something he says more explicitly in his other works. Prometheus himself wasn't just the son of Iapetus, but Iapetus himself was said to create his children with the daughters of Oceanus, who we might think of as an early representation of the same tribes of people that Poseidon now represents. As mentioned before, the worship of Poseidon predated Zeus, but he wasn't seen as a god specifically of the sea in his earlier times. The worship of Poseidon in the Greek area was started by the Mycenaeans, who were not just a coastal culture, but a maritime or boating culture. Their depiction of their god likely adapted some sea themes, but it wasn't until the introduction of Zeus by the Proto-Indo-Europeans that he would become a god of the sea specifically to represent this idea of this boating people who thrived off of their boating expertise. The founding of Athens itself was said to be something of a friendly contest between Athena and Poseidon, who competed to be the patron god worshipped by the Athenian people. Poseidon represented the ways of the old and presented the people with a powerful river extending from the ocean, but because it was saltwater, it was essentially useless. Athena instead offered the gift of wood, which could serve all sorts of purposes, from building homes to fuel for fire. Athena, as the daughter of Zeus, represented the growing presence of the Proto-Indo-Europeans in the Greek region as they began to merge with the existing Mycenaean culture, which would lead to the Mycenaeans becoming less dependent on that boating lifestyle. Prometheus likewise appears to be a representation of the Greeks having this sort of dual identity as the two cultures merge, Prometheus being aligned with Zeus, but being a descendant ultimately of the Oceanus Titan. This connection with the Greek people becomes even more clear in the historical writings of Hesiod, such as the Catalogue of Women. While this actual work is lost, it was quoted considerably by the writers that followed Hesiod, and through that we are able to piece together some hard facts about the Greek tradition that is corroborated by their oral history. According to the excerpts of the Catalogue of Women, modern Greek history started after a great flood event that essentially wiped the civilizations that existed off of the map and allowed for new smaller tribes to begin forming. The Greeks traced their origin back to an ancestor named Hellen, who himself was said to be the child of Deucalion. Deucalion was the son of Prometheus, who was warned by his father that Zeus was sending a great flood that would wipe out the humans. Deucalion took his wife on an ark to survive the flood, and in addition to being the direct ancestor of the Greeks, he was said to throw stone pebbles across the land after the flood that grew into the various peoples of the world. This means that the Greeks themselves traced their own biological origins back to Prometheus, who in many ways was a representation of more ancient sea peoples that we might associate not just with Poseidon in the Greek myths, but with his counterpart Yam in Canaanite myth, where Baal or Zeus had to do battle with him. Prometheus is shown as helping Zeus fight against the Titans in Theogony, but following this, the two engage in their own smaller battle of sorts. Being a creator of humans, Prometheus favors them over the gods and tricks Zeus into taking sacrifices of meat that were just bone and fat, which leaves the actual meat for the humans who did most of the farming work to enjoy. Prometheus then takes the secret of unwearying fire from Zeus and gives it to the humans. For giving this forbidden knowledge to humans, Zeus chains Prometheus to the earth, and makes it so that an eagle appears every day to eat his liver. Overnight, the liver painfully regrows so that the eagle may feast on it again the next day. This conflict and punishment can be seen as the Greeks' own perspective on what appears to be a more historical conflict that took place long before either of these cultures began to write these stories down. The idea of a sea peoples that the Greeks both hailed from and also fought with was something also found in later Greek legends such as that of Atlantis. The story of Atlantis was put out into the world by the Greek philosopher Plato from the 4th century before Christ. He claims to have received this story from Solon, a well-known Athenian statesman from the centuries prior, who was known for his travels to Egypt. In this time, Plato says that Solon learned of a parent culture to both of the Greeks and the Egyptians, which he referred to as Atlantis. In a retelling of creation leading up to the story of Atlantis, Plato recast some of the gods in order to better demonstrate his interpretation of historical events. Earlier, we discussed how Iapetus had his son Prometheus with the daughters of the Titan Oceanus. Iapetus also had other children with the daughters of the ocean, however, including Atlas. Atlas's association with the ocean titan was so prominent that our name for the Atlantic Ocean today just means the Sea of Atlas, a term used by Greeks since before the time of Plato. In Plato's work, however, Atlas is the son of Poseidon, showing how the worship of Poseidon within Greek culture stemmed from the same maritime culture that was associated with Oceanus and Iapetus' children. In Plato's account of Atlantis, he claims that they initially had rather noble lineage, but the Atlanteans fell in morality as they interbred with humans and became corrupt. After a final submersion from a great flood, the last remnant of the Atlanteans were said to attack the rest of the world in an attempt to maintain power. Athens, being closer to Atlantis than Egypt, ended up being pivotal in the defeat of Atlantis, which the Egyptians described as an important part in protecting the entire world from them. In the works of Hesiod, Atlas was said to have not sided with Prometheus, Zeus, and Poseidon, but with the Titans, for which Zeus punished him by forcing him to hold up the sky, illustrating a conflict between Zeus and the surviving remnants of these ocean peoples from the Atlantic area, similar to the one between Zeus and Prometheus. Plato's story of Atlantis came about 4 centuries after Hesiod cemented the ideas of the Greek mythological history, but it blends together different elements of those stories to give it a still mythological but much more historical account of early Athens history. It even ties in other Greek traditions, such as the competition between Athena and Poseidon for early control of Athens, and is theorized to be inspired not by actual accounts from Solon, but from a cross-examination of the familiar deities and other pantheons, perhaps even the aforementioned Baal cycle. By now, a lot of you are probably noticing that the Greek stories of Prometheus and the flood aren't just similar to the Canaanite myth of Baal versus the sea god, but also a bit similar to the stories of the Bible. The Old Testament, as we currently have it, is a series of stories that came out of the same region as the Canaanites, with modern scholars often seeing the Israelite culture as one that grew out of the Canaanites before eventually surpassing it. Much of the Canaanite mythology can be found in a monotheized context within the Bible, but it also has staggering additions that more so reflect the Greek narratives. Early Greek philosophers who read the book of Genesis were quick to equate Prometheus with the serpent from the Garden of Eden, who tricked humans into eating the fruit of forbidden knowledge. This knowledge was forbidden to humans by the chief god of the Jewish tradition, Yahweh, who would evolve to be the only god in the Jewish tradition. Yahweh is believed to have once been a smaller deity within the larger Canaanite cultures, who was likely first thought of as a descendant of Baal, and like Baal, he was known to be a god of thunder and storms. The Old Testament god thus was seen as playing the same role as Zeus in the Greek tradition, being the chief god of the world but forbidding certain knowledge from making it to humans. These flood myths are not just similar in story, but also have interestingly similar concepts behind their presentation. While we think of the flood myth in the Bible as just a myth, it is actually the beginning of history as was actually documented at its time, being followed by a genealogical chart of Noah's 3 sons Shem, Japheth, and Ham, which would go on to populate most of the known world. Now, in the Greek tradition, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades are the sons of Kronos, and in the Canaanite tradition, this was presented as El being the father of Baal, Yam, and Mo. But in the monotheization of world religions, these figures would become patriarchs in the Jewish Old Testament. Noah thus would take on the history associated with El and Kronos as a sort of ruling entity before the flood, with his sons being the proper division of the world in the early history of man. If Noah is Kronos or El, then that would mean Shem, who would be the father of the Semitic people who worship Baal, as well as the later Israelites, is the parallel for Zeus. Shem's brother is known as Japheth in our English Bibles. However, this is derived from the Hebrew letters Y, P, and T, which is often pronounced as Japheth in Hebrew, but which the Greeks saw as being Ya-pa-tus, due to the lack of vowels in the ancient Hebrew language, showing how the word may have once been pronounced. This made sense to them, as Japheth's descendants are described as taking over the land associated with the coastlands and islands that led directly into Greece. With the Bible being a monotheization of world mythologies, early Greek philosophers recognized Iapetus being related to Deucalion as similar to Japheth or Japheth being descended from Noah. the genealogies just being slightly out of order based on the historical perspective of the local culture in each case. The Jewish historian Josephus from the 1st century AD would go on to write that Japheth was in fact the father of not just the Greeks, but all of the European peoples who extended in the same northern and western directions. This was the area generally associated with the maritime culture that the Mycenaeans were associated with, not worshipping Poseidon themselves, but worshipping a god that the Proto-Indo-Europeans would associate with the ocean. This leaves the third brother Ham to fill in the role of Hades, which makes a lot of sense when you consider who Ham is the father of. Ham, or Chem in the Hebrew, was the father of certain tribes such as the Canaanites, the Cushites, and most notably the Mizraim, meaning the Egyptians. This was the term used to describe the Egyptians throughout the Bible, particularly in the book of Exodus. Ham itself is an English pronunciation, with the Hebrew term being closer to Chem, which was well known as the name for Egypt in ancient times. Chem simply means black in many languages and referred to the dark dirt that made up the large part of Egypt's land. Now in Egypt, we don't have an exact parallel to the Greek pantheon, with the god of thunder, water, and underworld all being brothers, but we do see the same key conflicts being played out from a more Egyptian perspective. If the god of the sea was seen to represent people from the more European regions along the coast, the underworld could be said to represent the Egyptian people and the others surrounding them. Like with the Greek tradition, the Egyptian pantheon has the deities that represent the people of Earth being born from a union of the earth and sky. In theogony, this was done by Gaia and Uranus, who give birth to the Titans. In the Egyptian pantheon, these are Geb and Nut, whose union brings forth Osiris and Set, as well as their sisters and other less powerful entities. The story of Osiris was that he was the god of the Egyptian people, who was tricked by his brother Set into a coffin shaped like a luxurious chest. Set said he wanted to make the chest as a gift for whoever would fit into it, but once Osiris was inside, he realized that it was a perfect trap for him and was locked within. Set throws the chest in a river, drowning Osiris, and then rips him into 14 parts. His wife Isis puts Osiris back together to revive him just long enough to impregnate her, leading to the birth of Horus. Horus is depicted as a falcon, and while this is not a god of thunder like Zeus or Baal, he is a god of the sky, representing more so the sun and that more primal worship that the thunder gods first came from. Osiris himself is said to become the god of the afterlife following his death, ruling over the world of the dead. The Egyptians thus had created a way to maintain the Proto-Indo-European idea of worshipping a sky god similar to what the Greeks had done, while also finding themselves descending from the god of the underworld similar to Hades. Set, interestingly, was seen as a god of thunder and storms and a god of foreigners. Specifically, the Egyptian people associated Set with the people of the Canaanite region, depicting Set as similar to Baal. Baal, as I said earlier, was known for his own myth where he fought against the ocean deity before eventually battling against his brother who ruled the underworld, Mot. Mot, interestingly, is an identical term to Ma'at in Egypt, which was used to refer to the concept of ultimate good, and which was personified as a goddess alongside Osiris. Both the Baal cycle and the story of Osiris and Set seem to depict the same battle from the second half of the Baal cycle, the battle between a thunder god, Baal or Set, and the god of the underworld, Mot or Osiris. While both stories depict themselves as the ultimate victor after being hurt by the other, the Egyptian doesn't paint it as entirely one-sided. Instead, Horus is said to actually castrate Set in their battle, with Horus losing one of his eyes to Set in this battle, this eye associated with the gift of foresight. The worship of the dead wasn't solely Egyptian, and really you can find it in most any culture, but the Egyptians in particular had developed a reputation for a focus on the afterlife and the spiritual world above, which means in the otherworld pantheons they were likely recognized and syncretized with their general god of the underworld. Now when it comes to Babylon and Mesopotamia as a whole, their story isn't as easily compared to the Greeks in regards to the genealogy. While Greece, Rome, and Canaan had similar genealogies of three brothers representing thunder, water, and the underworld, the Mesopotamian mythology is similar to that of the Egyptian, in that it has some allusions to these same themes, but ultimately its own genealogy that tells a related but different story. Instead, you could say that the Mesopotamian mythology shares more in common with the Greece in regards to it having a Promethean figure. This started in Sumeria, whose written mythology predates that of Greece by nearly 2,000 years, with flood myths dated as far back as 2900 BC. In these stories, it is the great leader of the gods, Enlil, who decides to send a flood that will wipe out the humans, because they have grown too noisy for his liking. Enlil's little brother is Enki, who is known in Mesopotamian mythology as the creator of humans, as well as the god who warns the humans of the upcoming flood from Enlil. This story parallels that of Prometheus and Zeus yet again, though unlike with Prometheus, Enki was arguably more worshipped in Mesopotamia than his older brother Enlil, despite Enlil, like Zeus, being the ultimate leader of the pantheon. Now, Prometheus and Zeus aren't brothers. At best, we might think of them as sort of cousins, both being children of different Titan families. But in ancient mythology, these relationships were just ways to describe how real-life tribes of people were connected through history. In the case of Enki, his worship began in the Sumerian city of Eridu, with Enlil starting off as the more well-known chief of the pantheon in the greater area. The characters of Enlil and Enki reflect the founding of Sumeria as an extension of the existing history of the Proto-Indo-Europeans, with Enlil being the parallel for Zeus, or the Sky Father. Enki, like Prometheus, is a symbol that represents the more local people, the history of them that is separate from their ancestral tribal history, one that in both cases seem to allow the people that are descended from them to almost die out in a great flood. Interestingly, while Enki and Enlil do not have an ocean-themed brother to battle against, they do engage in a battle against two ocean deities in the primeval story of the Enuma Elish from Babylon. In this myth, Enki and Enlil fight against Apsu, the god of the freshwater, angering his partner Tiamat, the god of saltwater of the sea. This god, angry that their partner who rules the freshwaters was killed, created a series of monsters to fight the gods, before they are ultimately defeated by the Babylonian god Marduk. The slaying of Tiamat represented a people of the ocean who had expanded into the mainland, it would seem, represented by their partner Apsu of the freshwater. This seems to parallel the story of the last of the Atlanteans, who were said to rise up and attack the mainlands after their final submersion from that last great flood as described earlier. Different versions of this flood myth are found all over the world, but most interestingly, it is the Norse mythology that claims to be the senders of the flood, similar to the role of Enlil or Zeus in these different pantheons. Norse mythology was not written down until much later than the other mythologies discussed so far, with the oldest written accounts of Odin coming from the prose and poetic Eddas of the 12th century after the death of Christ. At this point, Christianity had already spread into Europe, and it's hard to know how much Christianity and perhaps other religions and mythologies had influenced the Norse ideas by this time. In Norse mythology, creation was once ruled by giants that we could think of as similar to the Titans, before Odin, like Zeus, teamed up with his two brothers to slay their leader, Ymir. It was by slaying Ymir, the largest of the giants, that created the massive flood that covered the world. According to the Norse myth, it was actually one family of giants who managed to survive the flood by getting onto a boat, with the majority of giants dying in the flood of Ymir's blood. Odin, as the elder god in the Norse pantheon, is something of a composite or transitory god who represents a little of the old world that the giants once ruled, but he bridges the gap to the new world, which he places under the control of Thor. Thor is the god of thunder, similar to Zeus or Baal, and after Odin is the best representation for the Nordic peoples themselves. Odin, interestingly, is similar to Osiris in that he was seen as a god of the afterlife, or Valhalla, with a similar mythology to that of Osiris and Horus. Horus, like Thor, is a god of the sky, but one of Odin's other sons, Balder, has a nearly identical story. In the poetic and prose Edda, Balder is presented as the most beautiful and loved son of Odin, who is killed indirectly by Loki. Loki was said to kill Balder because Balder was prophesied to one day rule all of existence. However, even after killing Balder, there was a prophecy Odin received that his son would be revived from the dead after the final battles in the end times. But Odin himself would die, making him the permanent god of the afterlife and being joined by some of his other children. This reflects the story of Osiris himself dying to become the god of the afterlife after being killed by Set, with Horus rising to take his place. Now, this doesn't indicate that the Nordic peoples were somehow directly responsible for the flood, but rather some civilizations or peoples were likely seen as having prepared for the flood, perhaps just by merit of already being a boating culture, with others like those of the Babylonians seeing themselves as just barely being rescued thanks to the wise warning of a rebellious god like Prometheus or Enki. This concludes this current attempt to connect the world mythologies through the genealogies of the god, but I have more videos coming, so please subscribe subscribe so you don't miss what we have planned next. And if you can't wait, consider checking out our Patreon linked below. The free option comes with a bonus essay I wrote, and if you pay for one of our other tiers, you get early access to a lot more content. Currently, there is a free lecture there on the 6 days of creation from the Bible, but about 6 other topics exist in synthesized audio form as well. Let me know what topics you'd like to see more about in the upcoming videos, and I'll see you guys then.